Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you. It may be like church in here later, but no. No. Again, good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to see everyone in this room, especially after lunchtime. So thank you. So our job is going to be to keep the energy up and to keep the energy alive, and that's for all the speakers on the stage here. My name is Iruka. I am the Director of Research and Evaluation at the Buffett Early Childhood Institute at the University of Nebraska. So we're relatively a newly endowed institute at the University of Nebraska with the mission to transform the lives of young children, birth to age 8, especially children placed at risk due to poverty and other familial and social challenges. So this conference speaks to the work of the Institute and obviously to most of us in this room, if not all. So I'm really pleased to be the chair for this plenary for many, many reasons, and I'll just list a few. So one of my personal and professional goals is to make the experiences and lives of young children, especially children of color, and more emphatically, Black children better. Still reeling from the past week's shootings and killings, as well as prior ones from years and decades ago. I hope that this plenary will provide a safe space for several moments of self-reflection and understanding. As our nation continues to struggle with discrimination, inequity, injustice, violence, and trauma being visited on many, including our youngest children and families and communities, us, the early child community, has to be part of the solution to ensure that our children, families and communities, and early child professionals are valued and treated with dignity, especially those who feel disenfranchised and forgotten. Though I can say even much more, I want us to think about our role in all that we are facing. So with that said, it is my pleasure to welcome and introduce this plenary and our distinguished panel. So the focus of this afternoon's plenary is to discuss how teachers' intentional use of cultural and social interactions can successfully foster children of color's academic and social excellence. The speakers will also introduce a new classroom observation protocol designed to assess cultural and social aspects of classroom interactions called the Classroom Assessment of Social-Cultural Interaction for Preschool to Grade 3. This plenary closes by discussing how the use of the CASI, the acronym for this assessment, can help teachers improve the instructional practices, approaches, and classroom interactions, which in turn can promote children of color's learning and development. Maximizing teachers' use of social and cultural interactions in the classroom provides a foundation for improving the learning environments for children, especially children of color. So the speakers will have about 20 minutes each, allowing us time for deeper inquiry and conversation. And really, so the speakers will definitely keep their comments short, obviously within that 25 minutes, but it will allow us to really reflect and think about what they're saying as well as what we're thinking as you're hearing their thoughts. So the first speaker will be Chancellor Motley. He will provide some introductory remarks as one of the conveners for this first ACF National Research Conference on Early Childhood. So Dr. J. Keith Motley is the 8th Chancellor of the University of Massachusetts, Boston, a research university with 11 colleges and graduate schools and 17,000 students. Chancellor Motley oversees an ambitious strategic planning initiative to enhance the university's academic offerings and research enterprise, grow enrollment to meet the increasing demand for a well-educated workforce, and similarly build the university as a resource of knowledge and public service. Previous to his appointment as Chancellor on July 1, 2007, Dr. Motley served as Vice President for Business, Marketing, and Public Affairs at the University of Massachusetts President's Office. He's the founder of the Roxbury Preparatory Charter School and Chair Emeritus of the school's Board of Trustees. He's also the founder and education chair of Concerned Black Men of Massachusetts, Inc., and Paul Robeson Institute for Positive Self-Development, an academic and social enrichment program for school-aged children of color. Well, there really is not enough time to list off his accomplishments, so be sure to look him up. We all have smartphones and iPads, so Dr. Motley holds a bachelor's and master's degree from Northeastern University and a doctor of philosophy from Boston University. He also holds an honorary degree awarded by Northeastern University. I gotta finish, you deserve this. He's the graduate of the University of Pittsburgh Upward Bound program. So with that, I introduce the Chancellor.
So good afternoon, good afternoon, good afternoon. So you all just finished lunch, and you're wondering who this guy is that just crashed your event. See, they put me on the agenda, but I wasn't supposed to be on your agenda. However, when I heard about what was going on here, I decided I was going to come over to the Grand Hyatt on my way to where I'm really supposed to be speaking and take up some of your time, but also just hang out with you all for a little while because I just love hanging around y'all. I am here in this capital to deliver an address to some of the people who are going to lead universities in the future. And so I was so grateful when one of my faculty members asked me and told me that you all were doing this to be able to come here because you're talking about issues that matter to me personally, but you're also talking about issues that matter to our university and all the entities that you represent all across this wonderful country. I also had to come in here and see somebody from Boston who happens to be in Nebraska. That happens, you know. And so we're grateful for that. Also to Stephanie, to Bryant, and you're going to be virtually seeing Tonia come in to this. Thank you all for allowing me to crash. Having the opportunity to talk with you about increasing access to high-quality early child care and also education for all children is something that we all want to work together to bring to fruition. Bringing the diversity of children and families into early childhood programs and the need to develop services to address specific needs in that diverse population. The second generation approach where we support families in order to help children. Professional development strategies to increase worker effectiveness, considering the whole child, which includes health and social, emotional well-being in addition to academic skills, are all topics that I love, so I just crashed. Sorry about that. You're talking about the things that matter to me. I just needed to get here to lay my eyes on all of you to say thank you. Thank you for understanding that intersection, that ecosystem that you represent, the gift to the future that all of you are. What an amazing, amazing thing. Folks sitting down thinking and learning and sharing together from all of the sectors, making a difference not for you, but through you for the future. What an amazing thing. You understand the secret to life. That when you gift yourself like that, you live on and on and on and on through those who you sort of touch and serve. What an amazing, amazing thing. And so that's why I crashed. And I'm sorry for that. Rachel, sorry. I know you were here doing your sessions and all that, and here's your chancellor running through the lobby. I'm not checking on you. I'm just checking that box that says you are making a difference. So thank you for that. There's nothing more important. There's nothing more exciting than helping young people reach their potential. What an amazing thing. Professor Rachel Cohen, you've been reaching out. So here I am. Time for us to tune up and tune into the pulse of this research. My concern for the foundation years of children's lives, particularly those who come from underserved communities, is longstanding. I didn't come to this yesterday. Nobody dressed me up in a suit and sent me over here just to show up here to hang out with you because I needed that kind of tune-up. See, every now and then you need to go to the choir just so we can sing together and learn from each other. I can sing a mighty, mighty tenor, but I also can sing a mighty, mighty bass. I've been doing this work all of my life because someone has been putting this work in me all of my life. Somebody like you who opened up my eyes to what it means to want to learn, who opened up my eyes to what it means to want to make a difference, but also to listen and then take action. And so back in 1989, when I founded a school in the middle of Roxbury, if you haven't been to Boston, Roxbury is our spot. It's a spot where we go into and try to make a difference all of the time, because it's a place where people stopped believing in it a long time ago, and we never stop believing in the children that are there. In fact, the irony in all of it is that institutions in Boston have been trying to get Rhodes Scholars for a long time, and one of the first ones to come out of another institution there came from one of those kind of programs that you represent today. They were looking for that person to fall from the sky from some kind of celestial kind of planet of scholarship. And that person came right out of the hood because someone cared enough about that person to arm that person with knowledge and suppress all the ignorance related to anything else that sort of led that person away. So you're doing the right work. See, when I was starting a school, they wouldn't give me the money to start where I wanted to start. I wanted to start pre-K. They said there's not enough money for that. Start at middle school. Have you ever been inside? And some of y'all work in middle schools. I had no idea till I visited the 6th grade and I saw some of the young men being held hostage because the girls have grown already and they haven't grown yet. What an amazing thing. But there were 800 students on a waiting list to go to one school in Roxbury, because that one school was the island of hope for that community. Why should that be? And we didn't want it to be. And that's why I wouldn't care what they called the school, as long as it had the right values and value-driven people working in the institution who were committed to the success and excellence of those young people. And that's what I see all around me today. So that's why I crashed. I'm pleased to know that here at this conference, you are stimulating dialogue among early childhood practitioners, policymakers, and researchers, and that you're sharing information meant to expand our capacities around research. Not your capacity, our capacity. Don't you understand how unique this is? That everyone's talking and sharing. I watched you walking around the halls. Y'all been to conferences. This group walks around like they're different and better than that group. And you could smell it when you walked in. After lunch, you wouldn't see nobody. When she said crash after lunch, I said, well, that's cool. I'm going to walk into a room, there may be 10 people there. But I forgot who I was dealing with. See the mental model? Even those who are committed forget sometimes. That's what happens in schools. Even those of us that are committed forget who that young person is in front of us sometimes. That's why you need a tune-up. That's why research and policymakers and practitioners need to come together, and you need to be all of that, even though you profess to just be one singular function of that. There's nothing wrong with knowing some other part of your craft. I ran from research. Then they made me capstone instructor. Said, you want to be a professor, right? So you're going to be the capstone guy in the business school, but we're going to make you teach in the ed school too. And you're chancellor. Oops. You better bring your research A game and your practitioner B game and A game and your policy-driven A game to the game. So let me get off, because I know she said, I know that long was for me. When she said, don't talk too long. You only got 20 minutes. You didn't have any minutes. You're taking up their 20. You were not the keynote, Chancellor. But I'm not going to give you the hook because my family's from Boston too. I'm trying to be respectful. Don't you know I get excited? You should have never let me loose up here. All right? And then she told me, You know you can't leave the stage in case we have questions, but I'm just honored to be in your presence. With that being said, I am moving out the way so we can get this plenary session going. I look forward to learning with you and from you. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you. Thank you for energizing me on this trip through Washington. You have prepared me for whatever is ahead going forward, and I'm so grateful to you for that. Let's have a good rest of your conference and a great session. Thank you.
We needed that, Chancellor. We know we have plenty of time for you. Thank you. So I just wanted to introduce the three speakers. I know you don't see one, but I'll get to that in a second. I know you're inquiring. So I want to first introduce Stephanie Curenton. Dr. Stephanie Curenton is a Rutgers University Chancellor Scholar and tenured associate professor in the Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy. However, she will be leaving that position to join Boston University in the fall.
Magnet.
It is what it is, right? She studies the social, cognitive, and language development of low-income and minority children with various ecological contexts such as parent-child interactions, early child education programs, early childhood workforce programs, and related state and federal policies. I could say a whole lot more, but she can say more when she gets up here as well. And after that, we have Dr. Brian Jensen from Brigham Young University. He's an assistant professor in the David O. McKay School of Education. He's interested in improving learning opportunities for underserved children, particularly Latinos from Mexico and Central America immigrant families. His work addresses teaching quality, cultural aspects of social and academic learning, classroom observation, homeschool collaboration, mixed methods, and design-based approaches. So finally, you do not see Tonia Durden. Dr. Durden is literally seconds away from giving birth. So, and I should say this particular panel is special with kids. I'm pregnant, Bryant just had a baby, and Tonia due to have a baby, so you may want to stay away from most of us if you don't want any more babies. We are the baby producing factory panel here. So Tonia is joining us. I think she can see us from the live stream. So Tonia, if you're there, we obviously can't wait to meet baby Zoe. So Dr. Durden is from the University of Nebraska formerly, but now she's actually at Georgia State University. She conducts scholarly activity focused on examining how educators and families can support the socio-cultural and identity development and awareness of young children. Engaging in critical dialogues and partnerships with international scholars on issues of educational equity and identity development of children is an important part of her research. So with that, I'll bring Stephanie up.
So, good afternoon. I have a hard act to follow here. So, I'm here today to talk to you about a cultural lens to improve early childhood education interactions with children of color. And I have my own special remote. Okay. So, before I begin, I want to tell you just a little bit about my background. I can honestly say that I have been involved with early childhood education my whole life. I was a Head Start child in Pennsylvania, and as a young woman, I also was a volunteer and a substitute teacher in a Head Start program, and also worked in a child care center in the state of Virginia. I've also been involved in early childhood education across a variety of levels, as a student, as a teacher, but also as a researcher. So I've conducted various studies with the preschool population, and I've also had a small stint in the policy world as an SRCD policy fellow in the Office of Child Care. So to be here today as a researcher at this national conference and a plenary speaker is a full circle moment for me, and it assures me that I am on the right path, and it affirms my dedication to serving the children and families that mean so much to me. So I'm the first speaker in this series, and my purpose is to begin the discussion about how to enhance the quality of classroom interactions with children of color. Okay. There we go. So I will spend my time addressing three main points. So the first point I would like to address has to do with definition in terms of thinking what is culturally relevant pedagogy. The second is to address a rationale for why do we need it. And I want to just say that it is my intention to provide a rationale for why such pedagogy can add to what we already know is sort of good, universal, high-quality practice. And the third function is the third point that I will address has to do with function. And that is how can we improve children's lives? And what does it look like in action? Okay, so the first definition that I want to discuss is the term of culture. And a colleague who was a quantitative psychologist once said that cultural differences were what people used to explain statistical variance that could not be accounted for in the model. I was baffled by his statement. He saw culture as an afterthought, and it only mattered after you had looked at everything else, and I totally disagreed with him. I see culture as the beginning point. It is where we start because it undergirds everything that we do. So culture, like language, is a quintessential aspect of human nature. Culture is our social practices, our beliefs, our values, and our behaviors that we intentionally and unintentionally pass down from generation to generation. It is not something we're born with, it is something we learn. And it shapes our communication patterns, our interactions, and our preferences. It frames our worldview. And all of us have culture. In fact, all of us are in this room, are part of the larger Pan-American culture that is made up of the various subcultures within the US. And the institution that we're talking about today, education, also has a culture. So its cultural tradition is based on those beliefs, values, practices of Anglo-Saxon Protestant traditions that were dominant in the US during the 1600s when our public school system was being developed. And such traditions emphasize individualism, independence, and the value of scientific inquiry that takes the form of a linear and logical approach to problem solving and high-level reasoning. On the contrary, when we think about communities of color, these cultures focus more on collectivism, interdependence, and value a holistic form of reasoning that relies heavily on shared knowledge from others and contextualized experiences. So this distinction between the two cultures can result in differences in not only how children might prefer to learn, such as in small groups or through kinesthetic activities, but also how children express their knowledge. So in this presentation, I argue for the need for an expanded model that welcomes the cultural traditions found in those children of color whose ancestors were not part of the legacy group that has been shaping the US education policy system for the past 400 years. And we owe it to these children to expand our definition and our view of what is good pedagogy because they're valuable members of our society and our communities, and their cultural identity cannot be ignored. So, when we talk about culture as it relates to education, there are three prominent scholars who have shaped my views. And these scholars question not only the practice of education, but also the underlying theory that informs our practices, and they are dogmatic in explaining the issue of social justice and equity that needs to be placed front and center. In fact, Gloria Ladson-Billings criticizes that our education literature is filled with generic educational pedagogies that deem themselves as culturally neutral. when in fact they propagate the very tenets of the dominant white culture from which they were derived. Also, another scholar, Sonia Nieto, criticizes that most approaches to multicultural education avoid asking difficult questions related to access, equity, and social justice. So how do we move away from this? And how do we begin to take this literature about culturally relevant practice that these scholars have been discussing in the K through 12 realm into the early childhood realm? So a few years ago, I had the opportunity to write a book with my colleague Guillaume, and this book allowed us to do just that. It allowed us to think about the issues of culturally relevant pedagogy in the context of early childhood education. And we came up with a definition that we call culturally relevant anti-bias instruction. And we discussed this specifically in terms of a pre-K context. So like Lanson and Billings and Gay, we define this culturally responsive instruction as teaching that incorporates the cultural knowledge, experiences, and diverse learning and communication styles of children of color. But we also wanted to include some work by Louise Derman Sparks and Edwards, who work within the early childhood populations, and they incorporate a specific focus on social justice and inequalities like discrimination and racism and health and education disparities. And of course, because of the early childhood context, our pedagogical view is heavily focused on play, group learning, and collaborative discussion. And so these are sort of four of the goals of what we call culturally relevant anti-bias instruction. And in order to achieve these goals, teachers must be in agreement with the following things. For one, they must acknowledge that in the United States is comprised of subcultures that have positively contributed to the overall fabric of our society as a whole. And it's necessary to understand this for goal one because it acknowledges that these subcultures will promote a sense of pride in all children and connect them back to our larger Pan-American societal context. We also need to teachers also need to acknowledge and appreciate diversity and to talk about it and to share their unique experiences. They need to incorporate teaching materials and practices on a regular basis that reflect the cultural beliefs and experiences of children of color. And they also need to focus on empowering families to participate in their child's education by building homeschool partnerships and connections that go beyond the traditional classroom involvement. And finally, they need to think about how to incorporate the home language in a systematic and intentional way with the goal of maintaining and valuing home language while also promoting and strengthening what I call school language. And lastly, this is something that we don't do as well. We need to actively teach children to speak out against injustice and think about ways that they can begin on their preschool level to engage in active problem solving and active sort of justice seeking. So next I want to talk about the rationale for this pedagogy. So the first one, of course, has to do with cultural identity. The United States population is becoming drastically more diverse, and the cultural identity of the children and families cannot be ignored. And what's even more interesting is that our cultural identities are becoming more complex than ever before. So your cultural identity is comprised of your demographic characteristics, but geographic characteristics, your religion, and also social indicators. And so today, early childhood teachers are teaching children that might be culturally defined as an Israeli boy coming from an upper income Jewish family living in New York City. Or they might be teaching a Southern African American girl from the Pentecostal Christian denomination who lives in Oklahoma. Or they might be teaching a biracial second generation immigrant boy from a Haitian refugee family that speaks Creole. So people's cultural identity not only shape how they think and what they do and their worldview, but it also shapes how people view them as well and how people treat them. Okay. So the other rationale that I put forward has to do with linguistic diversity. So it should be no surprise that about 20% of the United States population speaks a home language other than English. And we call these, in the context of our work, we call these children dual language learners. In the 2010 census, it reports that 76% of Hispanics and another 77% of Asians spoke a language other than English at home. And it's also worth mentioning that 43% of Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders report speaking another language at home, and 29% of American Indians and Alaskan Natives. Only 8% of Blacks report speaking another language at home. But we have to realize that this number may be an underestimate of Black children's home language variation, because the dialects and the creoles and the vernaculars that these children often speak are not considered true languages. So nevertheless, they reflect diverse communication patterns and styles and diverse linguistic codes that are different from that standard school language expected. And another point that is really interesting, important to make, is that in addition to linguistic diversity, we need to understand that in addition to thinking about different languages that children speak at home, we need to understand the way in which that language is used at home could be different. So for example, there are variations in the age at which a child maybe was first exposed to English. There is variation in their adult caregivers' fluencies in English and their literacy in English versus their home language. There's also things for us to consider related to the amount of code switching and translanguaging that goes on within the home. And we also need to think about issues of linguistic isolation as well. But what does that mean? Why is that important? And how might that affect diversity in children's classroom participation? So I have an example to share with you. But I want to share with you this example, but it's not an example that you would expect, because the child is not speaking another language per se. Instead, it's an example of a child who is fluent in English, but who, because of her ethnic and cultural background, still has a communication style that is incongruent with that sort of school language. So before I tell you the example, let me provide you with a little background. Several researchers have talked about how communication can be classified on a continuum between low context versus high context. And in low-tech context communication styles, the primary emphasis is on explicit verbal expression and abstract descriptions. It relies heavily on diction and grammar and a linear narrative structure. On the contrary, in a high-context communication style, it relies heavily on implicit nonverbal behavior, such as facial expressions and gesture, and it emphasizes life experiences, social context, and connections among people. And the narrative structure tends to be circular, and it tends to involve several interrelated characters. Many Black and Latino children come from cultures that are characterized as high communication styles. And so children from these cultures might face a conflict during classroom conversations because the teachers are trained to teach and converse with students from a low context style. So let me share with you my example. This example comes from my colleague Dina Castro's work, and the book is called New Voices. So the example says, Miss Brown asked children in her classroom to describe an apple. Marchita raised her hand and started telling the teacher. The other day, I was in the kitchen with my mom because she asked me to help her make a pie. Miss Brown interrupted Marchita and said, I asked you what an apple is. Then another student raised his hand and Miss Brown said, okay, Jimmy, tell me what an apple is. Jimmy responded, an apple is a fruit. It's round, is red on the outside, and it's yellowish in the inside. Miss Brown said, that's correct. Good job, Jimmy. Martita kept quiet for the rest of the school day. So this example illustrates what can happen when a child from a high context community style engages in the classroom conversation with a teacher who is operating from a low context communication style. Martita began her description describing the social context in which she learned to make apples. The teacher could have responded in a culturally responsive manner by listening to Martita and first describe her life experiences that were the foundation of her knowledge, and then asking specific follow-up questions that would scaffold Martita's articulation to begin to talk about the concrete abstract definitions. Ooh. My second rationale has to do with racial socialization. So racial socialization is the parenting practice used by racial and ethnic minorities, especially blacks, in which parents send messages about instilling cultural pride in their children and preparing them for bias. This is an example of a quote from a middle-class mother in one of our studies. And in this statement, it's clear that the mother is articulating how she's preparing her son to deal with future bias by preparing him to be able to go above and beyond. Let me read this quickly. Black women have to raise their sons differently than white women raise their sons. First, in general, the general standard for each of us is to raise either white or black children, either white or black, to be respectable and to follow directions and all of that. But then later on, we kind of have to instill in them that they have to do a little bit more. They have to achieve more, achieve at school, and have a good work ethic. It's just kind of believing in the black community that the black children have to work harder to get where they need to go. So this is an important aspect because it talks about, Foster urges how, in order for us to consider the effectiveness of teaching African American students, teachers have to be involved in recognizing and paying attention to the ways that racism constructs people's identity in their lives. So just quickly, how might this affect classroom practice in the teachers? Well, during difficult times like this, during difficult times such as this, when there are so many young black children who are being murdered, unjustly murdered, teachers need to recognize that families are going through a period of mourning. There's a collective mourning in the black community every time these shootings happen. And for a teacher to recognize this and go to a parent and provide a safe space to have these discussions and to reassure that parent that I love your child and your child is safe with me and I'm going to do all I can to protect them, goes a long way in terms of showing respect and caring. Okay. The last rationale that I'm going to put forward has to do with professional development and how I believe that culturally responsive practice can really elevate the interactions in our classroom by helping teachers to carefully look at their biases. So I'm going to skip ahead and show you a very poignant video that discusses this. And I'm going to point to Anthony. Oh, it starts at 2.
When I use the term codes of power, I'm foremost talking about the reality that culture informs everything that we do. And that most white people, because we live in a country where we see ourselves everywhere in every way, and our culture is validated everywhere and in every way, we don't understand how our cultural values are brought into the classroom. So when a white boy walks in the room, we understand him. We have similar cultural values. We understand how to behave, how to talk, how to respond to one another. If I'm a white woman and he's a white boy, he can see me as his mother. I can see him as my child. That positions him to know not only that he's right in the world, but that he deserves to feel comfortable and that he is really claiming his rightful place in the world to be a leader. A white boy who walks in the room and is animated and moving around and maybe even a little cheeky is smart. And isn't he smart? Isn't he cheeky? He's almost looked at as, well, boys will be boys. a boy of color, especially an African American boy who walks in the room exhibiting the same behavior, walks in and it's, I might need to keep an eye on him. And that, I really believe, is our internalized racism, that we are afraid of these young boys. And I'm talking young boys, 4 years old and above. And that instead of the teacher looking at him or herself and saying, what is going on with me? That this same behavior creates fear in me instead of admiration. We pathologize the boy of color.
Okay, so I like to show that video because I think it's very poignant. And just to reiterate, we know that the research shows that that teachers have less positive relationships with African American and Hispanic children, and teachers especially have a hard time forming secure attachment relationships with these children when the relationship is conflictual. And remember that the relationship might actually be conflicted due to the teacher's own bias, because the teacher sees these children as less favorable. And we also know from the research that teachers do not engage in as much one-on-one instruction with minority children, and they also don't have as many social interactions or social conversations with them. And these types of interactions also impact students in terms of their behavioral suspensions. We know that African American children, preschoolers, are 3 times more likely to be suspended than white children. And there's research, when you look at the implicit bias research, it goes even deeper to show that there's a colorism aspect to this sort of school discipline policy, and that African American boys and girls who are darker skinned are more likely to be suspended. So just to reiterate some of the things that we know about implicit bias, it's a natural part of human cognition. Everyone has this bias, even teachers, and it's formed early in our life, even as early as preschool. It's a learned behavior, and that everyone in our American society has what would be considered a pro-white bias. And a pro-white bias means that whites and people who are lighter skinned are viewed more positively. They're seen as less aggressive and smarter, more social. It's time for us to acknowledge that these implicit ideas affect our everyday interactions with children. So I'm going to wrap up briefly and talk about sort of the function. So what would culturally relevant anti-bias instruction look like in the classroom? And so I won't spend a lot of time on this because my colleague Bryant will be sharing some work that we're doing across these dimensions that we have developed related to what we consider to be culturally relevant instruction. But just to list some of the things, one aspect of culturally relevant anti-bias instruction, it needs to incorporate the non-school language. It needs to personalize academic content to be connected to children's everyday lives and lived experiences. It needs to value freedom of expression in terms of differences in personality, style, humor, talents, and abilities, and it needs to promote equitable expectations related to academics for all children, meaning it needs to teach to a high standard with scaffolding to bring all children up to that standard, not teach from a remedial perspective. It also needs to support cultural identity and acknowledge children's racial identity and how that impacts their everyday lived experience. It needs to actively challenge inequity by preparing young children to speak out against injustices, giving them the words, giving them the tools to actually talk about this. Also, focusing on peer collaboration and really fostering that social network that children have with each other and with their community. And last, I talk about sort of emotionality and really understanding that there needs to be a safe space in the classroom for children to show the full range of their emotions and to talk about them and be given the words to talk about them. And as Aroma Iruka and I have written another book that has to do with family school partnerships from the same culturally relevant anti-bias instructional point. And we need to think about sort of family engagement and how family engagement is also a critical aspect of this pedagogy. And I'm going to leave with my final quote related to this. This quote comes from my colleague, Sonia, I don't know her, sorry, if she's here, Sonia Nieto's work. And she is quoting a bilingual teacher named Lisette Roman. And Lisette says, "To have knowledge of another culture does not mean to be able to repeat one or two words in a student's language, nor is it to celebrate an activity or sing a song related to their culture. To acknowledge and respect is to be able to understand and apply this knowledge to everyday classroom activities. It is to be able to make changes or modifications in one's curriculum or pedagogy when the needs of the students have not been served. It is to be patient, tolerant, curious, creative, eager to learn, and most important, non-authoritarian with students. In order for a teacher to promote excellence in education, there has to be a real and honest connection between the needs and the cultural values of teachers and students. This is culturally responsive education." Thank you.
Good afternoon. I can, without reservation, say that this is a definite pinnacle in my early career to be among such an esteemed panel and to be in a room full, and I mean full, of committed educators. This is my first time to this meeting, and I've been impressed by your commitment, by your insight and and the diversity of topics that have been addressed. My background is as a school psychologist originally. I wound up in graduate school doing work with Eugene Garcia. Some of you may know him. Part of my job with him was to work on a task force, an early education for Hispanic task force, where we commissioned papers and we wrote policy briefs, had some meetings here on Capitol Hill at the Press Club, and I was able to see firsthand how research evidence can influence policy. Some of our recommendations made their way into the ACF reauthorization of Head Start and so on. And I was blown away by that. It's like, wow, people will actually read your work? But one of the things from this work that I was disappointed in as we were reviewing the literature, looking at sort of instructional practices that yield certain developmental benefits for, in this case, Latino children, was that there wasn't the evidence, the kind of evidence that we wanted to demonstrate that culturally responsive practices really yielded the developmental benefits that we hoped they would. And as we dug deeper, we came to the conclusion that this was primarily a limitation of measurement and research design, not because of lack of rich conceptualization, as was just mentioned. And so since then, I've tried to, over the last 5 years or so, devote a large part of my career with colleagues to develop an observation protocol. And I'll present a little bit about that protocol today. I will say from the outset that it's still very much a preliminary protocol. It's not ready for mass sort of production or distribution, but that's where we're hoped to be heading. A couple years ago, Ioma introduced me to Stephanie, and then subsequently to Tonia Durden and Marisha Humphreys, who's here as well, and we've developed a research consortium to refine this protocol further, particularly looking at classroom interactions for young African American children. And that too has been a pinnacle in my research career. In large ways, we're trying to find complementarity between two bodies of research. On the one hand, we know from rigorous developmental psychology research that there are sort of achievement gaps that cut across domains of academic learning and knowledge and so on. We know that there are social class orientations to those gaps. But the other body of sort of knowledge is from other fields in linguistic anthropology, in multicultural education, in cultural studies and education that demonstrate the developmental strengths within communities of color and within underserved communities. And it's one of the things we've been trying to do is merge these fields, and it's difficult. There are epistemological issues, how do we define knowledge? There are methodological issues, there are conceptual issues, and they're difficult. But I've been pleased to sort of do this work with people smarter than I and with people who are just as committed to find resolutions, and I feel like we're on the right path. Because doing this complementary work, this interdisciplinary work, really matters. We argue that it's not sufficient to just approach the development and learning of children of color from a traditional psychological paradigm. When we do so, we create deficit thinking among teachers. Teachers see cultural differences inherently as deficits, and that underlies low expectations in the classroom and some of the other statistics that Stephanie mentioned. On the other hand, just using a cultural paradigm also has its limitations. We do know that there are universal sort of dimensions of instructional quality that are important for all kids, and we shouldn't sort of use an excuse to sort of distribute equally and equitably those instructional approaches. So you can begin to appreciate that this work is complex, right? And that there are no simple solutions. And if there's anything we know so far, it's that interdisciplinary approaches really matter. And so you get a sense from the work that these are values that we try to embrace as we continue to move forward with the development of this observation protocol, and more importantly, that this observation protocol will translate into professional development models that can improve culturally responsive practices in classrooms, and subsequently develop and test instructional paradigms that have direct effects on the achievement of children of color. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. That's all introduction. Oh, I have the clicker somewhere. Oh, here we go. Thank you. See what I mean? I need a community here. Oh, okay. You mean right is forward? So the essential question that we're trying to address is, how do we bring culturally responsive practices in classrooms to scale? I'll use culturally responsive and equitable sort of interchangeably in this in this presentation. And so I'm going to quickly, because Stephanie did such a great job, and I think Tonia is going to touch more on conceptual arguments for culturally responsive teaching. I'll just go through that quickly. And then I'll introduce the classroom assessment of sociocultural interactions, or my Latino colleagues call it the CASI, which I like because CASI in Spanish means almost, and the measure's almost there. And but we also refer to it as the CASI. And then lastly, sort of want to just make some points about framing these interactions and how we should think about this in terms of classroom quality and instructional improvement. So we know, as mentioned, that culture is not something that's static, it's fluid. It's about what people actually do. It's less about an ethnic label. Culture is not an individual trait, but a series of practices, or what Chris Gutierrez and Barbara Rogoff call a repertoire of practices. We know that there are multiple reasons for attending to these practices in early childhood classrooms. There are affective reasons, there are socio-political reasons, perhaps now more than ever, and there are real instructional reasons, right? If there's any sort of pedagogical sort of axiom that exists currently, it's that all teaching must build on prior knowledge and experience. We can't sort of come to terms with that truth without also considering differences in cultural experiences and knowledge outside of school, right? So there are multiple reasons for engaging in culturally responsive teaching. So on the one hand, culturally responsive teaching is intended to build on the developmental strengths of children of color. I study children of Latino immigrants, particularly from Mexican and Central American families. We know that there's a developmental paradox for many of these kids who demonstrate strong social behavioral competence associated with a parenting model of bien educado, right? But on the other hand, they demonstrate sort of low academic functioning and school language proficiencies. So it's paradoxical because typically those two things go hand in hand in the mainstream US population. We know that culture responsive teaching tries to sort of connect academic with cultural identities, and that it's intended to, as Gloria Ladson-Billings argues, improve academic success, real and perceived success. Yet, on the other hand, as I alluded to, there's limited empirical evidence. There's a lot of terms, right? And people use the same terms in different ways. And there's little clarity distinguishing what's generic or important for all children to learn and what's sort of sociocultural or what's local in terms of what's important in particular contexts in terms of classroom quality for children to learn. So this is our model. These constructs should look familiar to you after hearing from Professor Curenton. We organize much like the class measure, the classroom assessment of. You all know that measure, right? You know that better than I do. This tool is organized in a very similar way, with some distinctions. We have domains. I think I have a laser here. Domains and dimensions. Within these dimensions, we have indicators, and that's the level at which we score this measure. I think the class does the scoring at the dimension level. We're sort of in this sort of development phase, and we think that scoring at the indicator level is really important to come up with not only a measure that has strong psychometric properties, but also a measure that can be broadly used across multiple contexts. So I will say from the outset, this measure is not intended to be ethnic or racial or socioeconomic specific. It's meant to sort of address constructs that are relevant across contexts, but are meant to be used sort of in particular contexts and interpreted in ways that are local. So this references a paper that we currently have under review, our initial psychometric study of the measure. So I want to go through the constructs, and I said I wasn't going to go into a lot of the technical details, but I want to identify the constructs, what we think are sociocultural elements of teacher-child interactions that matter to the learning and development of children of color. First, language use, right? How classrooms gauge and incorporate the natal non-school languages. This can be a language system like Spanish or Korean, or a language variety like African American vernacular. Content personalization, the extent to which the teacher sort of acknowledges and appreciates students' out-of-school differences, and then also makes that second step to connect them explicitly, like was mentioned by Stephanie, to what's being learned in the classroom learning objectives, right? You can see that doing this well requires a teacher to move beyond a deficit mindset. If the teacher only associates what happens in children's home lives as things that are deficient, it's really difficult for them to sort of see them as knowers. Like this references the Funds of Knowledge work by Norman Gonzalez and Luis Moll and others. And then lastly, within this domain, we have the equity dimension, the extent to which, in developmentally appropriate ways, you talk about social injustice in terms of societal experiences, but also children's own personal experiences, right? Fairness, privilege, and so on. The second domain references Professor Curenton's comments about interdependence, right? And this one is particularly important for looking at cultures that are not part of that sort of Anglo-Saxon Protestant norm, that are more collectivistic. We know from some work already that cooperative learning strategies actually have larger sort of achievement benefits for children of color than for white, middle class, and higher children. And so competition is a dimension. Obviously, more competition is associated with more independent interactions, collaboration associated with more interdependent interactions, and social organization, drawing on the work by Barbara Rogoff and others, associated with interdependent interactions. And lastly, the extent to which children can experience choice and freedom in the classroom. And in some ways, this feels very natural to early childhood educators, which sort of allow for more sort of center-based learning and so on than in the sort of K-12 system. But as we look deeper, there are also ways in which children of color have very few sort of opportunities to express themselves in a way that are sort of contiguous with their knowledge and experience from outside of school. Autonomy. Role flexibility. To what extent do teachers function as learners and students function as teachers in the classroom or as knowers, right? And equitable expectations. It's not enough to sort of communicate high expectations to some students. To what extent do we communicate high expectations to all students? So in other words, this last dimension looks at the distribution of high expectations in the classroom through the interactions with children. So just a little bit of research. We've done a few studies. The first one was with the measures of effective teaching, which is a 4th through 9th grade sample. We looked at grades 4 and 5. Most of these settings are in inner city schools. The classrooms, the 40 classrooms that we looked at were mostly African American majority. We did a long set of sort of qualitative studies where we used the model and tried to identify markers, things that we can actually see in a discrete 15-minute period, and how do we code those in a reliable way. We went through several iterations of the observation protocols, and finally we conducted a generalizability study with a lot of help from Edward Hartle, who was sort of an inordinately generous mentor on this study. And we found that at the domain level, we, accounting for, measurement error associated with raters, with the lessons, and with the segments within lesson, at the domain level, we had decent reliability between, I think it was like 0.75 and 0.80 on the G coefficient, which is similar to the Cronbach's alpha. And at the dimension level, it was more varied. Actually, the strongest dimension in terms of reliability was actually language use, which was encouraging. In the second study, we've done the same work using better classroom videos with actual live videographers in Mexican classrooms. So actually in Mexico, I've done this work with Rebecca Mejia Raus, and we collected videos in Aguascalientes, and we refined the rubrics further, applying sort of the learning by observing and pitching in theory by Barbara Rogoff and others, and we're currently conducting that reliability analysis. So overall, we found that in terms of just basic descriptives from these studies, that there is minimal connection to children's out-of-school lives, especially the equity that happens very rarely. Equity among all the other dimensions was most associated with lessons, actually. So the curriculum, in other words, seems to be driving the extent to which teachers are talking with children about social justice issues, right? So 40% of the overall variation in equity scores across all of these classrooms was associated with just the lesson, which is really actually helpful to understand that. We find that classrooms are somewhat interdependent. There's a lot of variation across classrooms. We find that there's a moderate amount of child choice and freedom that's in reference to the agency domain. We have a decent factor structure, and there are those findings that I mentioned earlier. So, how am I doing on time? Okay, 5 minutes. So just some conceptual questions, like how do we apply this to classroom improvement, right? It's not enough to say you have to have a classroom that is culturally responsive, right? Because there are other dimensions of instructional quality that are universal or generic, right? Some of these may be affective, organizational, or instructional. These are things that probably look familiar and are on measures of like the class, right? But on the other hand, there are cultural dimensions as well that I argue interact with rather than replace universal dimensions. We have to think about these things in tandem rather than separately. And that's what a measure like the CASI affords, is to be able to do the analytic, the empirical work, the theoretical model building, to think about how sociocultural dimensions of teaching in early childhood and in other settings are associated with universal dimensions of teaching, and for what purpose, associated with what sorts of developmental gains, right? And so the social cultural dimensions concern the sort of notion of making meaning, the child, in other words, seeing the content in herself or himself. Roland Tharp talked a lot about that, Ron Gallimore in their book, Rousing Minds to Life. It's also about addressing the classroom context. And so another way to think about these domains of the CASI is that we have to think about the content of interactions, to what extent are they connected, and the form of interactions, to what extent are they communal, right? These are elements of socio-cultural interactions, or elements of equitable teaching. So what is equitable? I've already sort of made the case that it's not just about sort of evenly distributing high-quality practice, which is what we hear over and over again, right? It's not just about getting high class scores in every classroom. I would argue that that's necessary but not sufficient, right? Gloria Ladson-Billings argues that culturally responsive teaching is not just good teaching, right? In the same breath, neither is just sort of making instruction meaningful adequate, right? We have to think about these two things in tandem, how they interact with one another. In one study, this is in the Elementary School Journal, Leslie Reese and colleagues and I found here on the y-axis is the extent to which classrooms in rural California serving 95% Latino children of agricultural migrants, how much Spanish were they using sort of socially with the children. And then this here are their class scores on emotional support. So in other words, those teachers who communicated more sort of socially in Spanish with their children, redirecting, communicating sensitivity, ay, mi hijo, no hagas eso, haz más para acá, mi hijo, right? Those sort of, that way of communicating sort of colloquial affect was associated also with a universal dimension of quality. So we can't think just about language use, we can't think just about emotional support, we have to think about how they interact. And we found this in a mixed methods study that I can share with you if you're interested. Moreover, and this gets to the sort of notion of theory building, it's not enough to say that sociocultural dimensions and generic dimensions interact to affect Y outcome, right? We have to also think about how context factors are mediating this process. Context factors like teacher-child racial match. Context factors like, the teacher credentials. Context factors like the dispositional qualities of teachers. In teacher education, I'm in a department of teacher education. We talk a lot about dispositions, right? And we haven't measured them very well, but we think that they're important. In some other work, we recently found that there are 3 sort of dispositional factors in terms of preparing teachers to work in diverse multicultural settings. Their awareness, their meekness, and their advocacy. To what extent do those dispositions sort of moderate these effects? So that's a question, obviously, for the future. These are colleagues that I've worked with so far to date. I'm looking forward to Stephanie and I have recently started on an African-American sort of preschool project to refine this measure further. I look forward to learning with them, and if you have any questions, please contact me. If you'd like to have my slides or have any of the papers that I referenced, I'd be happy to send them to you as well.
Hello, my name is Dr. Tonia Durden, and I'm a clinical associate professor at Georgia State University. I would like to thank the organizers as well as my fellow plenary presenters for allowing me this opportunity to provide this reported video as my husband and I await the birth of our brilliant, beautiful baby girl. As you know, our session is named Using a Cultural Lens to Improve Early Childhood Classroom Interactions with Children of Color. And I want to briefly culminate this discussion with a common topical thread of why culturally relevant pedagogy, why now? And reflecting on Chancellor Motley's message, as well as the dynamic presentations of Drs. Jensen and Curenton, I hope that the plenary today has provided ideological and pedagogical tools and considerations as you think about ways in which the measures you use to assess program and teacher quality are culturally meaningful and significant. And what about our workforce? How are we striving towards a higher standard of excellence in our own professional development, skills, and competencies, going beyond just good teaching to culturally responsive teaching that is sustainable and truly improves the holistic development of young children? So I hope that the information today has really sparked and shifted the way we think about the teaching and learning of culturally and linguistically diverse children. Now, a saying that the Maasai tribe uses in their greeting, their traditional greeting, is Kasanyan and Jari, which is in how are the children. And so the expected response includes the children are well. So I want you to think about the children that you work with every day. And if I was to ask you, and how are the children, or Kasanyan and Jari, would you be able to say, and all is well? And it is my hope that as we think about it, we go through the different sessions for today, we're able to get closer and closer to saying, and all children are well. So as we're thinking about this concept of all children are well, we can't really think about it without reflecting upon the past century or so of the education of diverse children in our schools across America. For example, Langston Hughes' Posse poem that was written in actually the 1950s reads, I could tell you if I wanted to what makes me what I am, but I don't really want to and you don't give a damn. So what this poem by Langston Hughes illustrates is often what we find in teaching and learning of culturally diverse students. And the research and educational leadership really has produced practices, scholarship, and programs that really don't capture or have not captured the cultural tools and gifts and strengths that these children bring with them to the classroom. So if we take a historical look at how children of color have actually been provided quality education, then we have to acknowledge and also respect the inequities that have occurred over time. So it really is my hope by the information presented today that you have the momentum and will truly give a damn about the educational success and quality and teaching and learning and assessment of culturally diverse children and families. And as you see on the screen, these are all the pioneers that have really paved the way to providing a pathway of understanding of how we can strive towards having all children be good, particularly diverse children, and reaching toward a higher standard of excellence and equitable educational experiences. Now, in our plenary, we have some basic assumptions about the teaching and learning of children of color. And so these basic assumptions mean, first of all, that there's this theory of mind and affect, that we value the culture, we see language, and we use that for all teaching and all learning. We also respect the 80 years of research on the holistic development of culturally responsive education of diverse children. And in practice, we understand, or in the process of understanding, our own culture. And we also have the intentionality of teaching who we are, our own culture and language, as well as who the children are responsibly. Also, our assumption is that we actually take the initiative to understand, to become knowledgeable about, and share with others our systems, how our systems actually contribute to and reduce cultural and racial disparities and inequities. So we think about our systems as our own interactions with children and families, as the policies in our programs, as our curriculum, and even wider macro type of systems that we can actually impact in the teaching and learning of diverse children. So in the literature, the term culturally relevant, culturally responsive actually means the pedagogy that actually empowers students, motivates students, and that change in students that is intellectually, socially, emotionally, and politically using of the cultural tools and references that children bring with them to the classroom. And that is the pioneer of this term, which is Gloria Ladson-Billings. So when we think about what exactly does that mean, empowering socially, emotionally, politically? Well, first, teachers must believe that all students can succeed. They must maintain these affirming student-teacher relationships and also see excellence as a complex standard that takes students' diversity and individual differences into account. And so these are not touristy practices or touristy curriculum where we talk about children's culture and their language and their home and their cultural references at Black History Month or Cinco de Mayo or Thanksgiving, but actually that these are built over time and the basis for all learning and all teaching. Secondly, learning is socially and culturally mediated, and these are both cultural and linguistic experiences, the multiple literacies children bring with them to the classroom. And also, intentionally and effectively using all of these languages and the cultural tools that they bring for both the dominant and also marginalized sectors in our society. And lesson building cautions us and says we're having a lot of pedagogical strategies that we use to support the culture and language in the classroom. But one of the things we have to work more towards is making sure that our programs, our interactions with children actually create equitable spaces for young children. So a critical part of culturally relevant teaching is having a deep understanding that teaching is a socio-political act, and how our classrooms and our interactions with children support equity, it supports justice, and also opportunity, and also how we can engage in critical reflective practice to make sure that we are creating these equitable spaces for young children. Well, that's just good teaching, some of you may say. Well, yes, and culturally responsive education actually combines culturally relevant teaching and best practices with the culturally relevant and believe in as the base for all teaching and for all learning. So, ¿qué pasa ahora? What do we do now? I'm glad you asked. First, we have to shift our language, our beliefs, and our theory of mind. So what this means is we have to go from this tale of hardships and achievement gaps and deficit to actually shifting towards identifying and building upon what children bring, what they have, this strength-based ideology. We have to stop focusing on closing the achievement gap of at-risk children and disadvantaged children, and really shift towards a thought of closing our own cultural and knowledge gap as educators, leaders, and professionals, and stop gap gazing and actually create opportunities for children. And we have to think about the ways in which we're labeling children as well. We have to reframe our ideology and our language. So we have to go from this minimum basic standards towards an actual standard of excellence. So we have to shift towards a standard that has high expectations for children. So one of the take-home tasks I want you to think about is, what language do you use to describe, label, and categorize the children you serve? Is it that all of our children have the capability of excellence and higher learning, and they have these cultural tools and knowledge that they bring with them? Or do you label them in your pamphlets and in your descriptions of your program as at-risk, disadvantaged children that I serve? What beliefs do you have? This is that critical reflection part. What beliefs do you have about the children and families that you actually serve as well? Secondly, we need to become critically conscious professionals. What does this mean? We need to be reflective of ourselves, of society, of social relations, and also the actual teaching learning processes. We need to see color, and we need to see language, because we can't build on children's culture and the tools and the knowledge they bring if we don't see their color, if we don't see the language that they're bringing. And we have to understand that it's very complex, the ecological systems of all of these influences that impact the diverse learning of children who come from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, who are placed at risk, particularly those who are placed at risk. So how do we really understand this complexity of all of these influencing factors and really focus in on the strengths that they bring with them? So when we reflect, what we do is we ask, how are children's voices and experiences being respected and affirmed? How does the program or school's culture actually create dissonance for students and their families instead of actually creates bridges? How is power exerted by teachers, by the assessment, by the curriculum, by the schools, by the policies that actually stamp out culture and language, and instead imposes our own language and our own dominant ways of thinking onto children and families? And how do you transmit this dominant ideology and belief that may be different than the children that you serve? So the take-home task for our second point is thinking about, what are my knowledge, beliefs, and experience about the children and families I work with? Some of the teachers that I've worked with in the past have expressed to me, well, after dark, I'm really afraid to stay in the program in the actual facility where I work. And so my question is, if we're afraid of the children, if we're afraid of the community, and if we're afraid of the families, then how can we truly provide culturally responsive educational practices? And how can we bridge that gap so that we're not afraid, and so that we can truly build upon the knowledge and skills that children bring with them? So first, what are my beliefs and experiences? And how do I reflect critically on how I may be perpetuating inequity and also this cultural mismatch towards children, families, and even my colleagues? And do I truly understand this complexity of the multiple systems that are impacting my own teaching and learning, as well as the learning and teaching of diverse children and families? So lastly, we are master professionals, and we will strive towards high quality. And so one of the bases for this work is to really think about creating and developing a cultural inventory. How does the physical environment captures the human diversity within and outside of the setting? How does the interactions and practices actually build upon the culture and language of the children and families you serve? And how are you really equipped with the necessary skills and tools to implement and assess culturally responsive education? Here are just some very basic resources that I would recommend that comes from my colleagues and I, as well as the plenary presenters, Rethinking Readiness in Early Childhood Education. I have a chapter in this book that's focusing on, are we truly ready as it relates to school readiness for culturally and linguistically diverse children? We also have Dr. Jensen's Regarding Education, as well as Dr. Iruka's and Curenton's Building Practitioner Competencies to Work with Diverse Families, if that's an interest. Dr. Gloria Boutte, Multicultural Education, really raising this consciousness. And if you really want to think about that equitable piece that I was talking about earlier, Michelle Alexander has a phenomenal book about the new Jim Crow and about the school-to-prison pipeline that really does impact many of the children that we serve and that we work with. So again, and lastly, I ask Kasanian and Jari, and how are the children? And I do hope that we will be able to say, and all as well. So if you want any continued conversation, please don't hesitate to give me, shoot me an email. Again, I'm Dr. Tonia Durden, and I can be reached at tdurden@gsu.edu. Thank you, and have a wonderful rest of the session. And now Dr. Iruka will take it further with any further questions and reflections. Thank you.
All right. Wow. I want to first, foremost, thank the Chancellor, thank Stephanie, Bryant, and of course Tonia, who did an amazing job from a pre-taped remark. So we still have about 7 minutes for questions from obviously the Chancellor and everybody else in the audience as well. So there are microphones I see already out there. So this is the time, if you have any questions, any commentary, any of that, we're happy to sort of hear, and the speakers are happy to take your questions.
Hi. What is the best way to address this issue of implicit bias in like schools, in any sort of place where maybe people, primarily white people, don't know how to really even start the conversation among other white people?
Okay, hi. Is this on? Okay, yes? So what some private companies have begun to do is create what they call de-biasing trainings. And so there are people, usually led by social psychologists, as well as, that are working with private companies to create de-bias trainings. I think that what we really need to think about as a field is to think about sort of creating sort of models for such trainings that can be incorporated into our professional development system, as well. So that's one of the ways. And other ways are, as an individual, just sort of being brave enough to raise the question, to speak out, being brave enough to, like I said, interact with families and acknowledge issues of race and racism, being meek enough, as Brian talks about, to not be defensive when a family brings up an issue of race to you, right? To not sort of go on the defensive about that. And then also being brave enough within the context of your other professionals to speak up and to raise this issue and to say that you as an individual are not going to stand for this, that it offends you as well.
Thank you.
Hi, so I was very happy to hear that you talked about language. I was also happy that not that long ago there was an SRCD policy report on dual language learners and policies, and there was a whole section dealing not only with speakers of Spanish or Chinese, etc., but for the first time in something that's produced by the government, there was an acknowledgement of bidialectal language learners. But then I was very sad a week ago when Head Start had a webinar on dual language and released a new policy, and there is not a single word in the dual language learners there is no clear guidelines or clear acknowledgement that we also have all these children who speak different varieties of English, and not only they need to be acknowledged, but they need to be seen as a richness. And I teach speech-language pathologists to deal with these children, and I'm a linguist myself, so I find it fascinating. I never wanted to work on English until people who shared with me all their different varieties of English dragged me into English. So I feel there is a lack of communication here going on. And on the one hand, I'm very happy to hear you mentioning language today, but I'm very sad that there is no connection with those new federal policies, and I just wanted to hear your reaction on this.
So I completely agree with what you're saying, and I think I've always felt, as someone who studies language development in general, is that when we look at the dialects and the vernaculars, what we're really facing a stronger linguistic chauvinism than we do when we're talking about another set language. And so I think it's something that we just have to continue to fight for and have to acknowledge and insist upon that's at the table, and that these systems of communication, regardless if there are dialects or vernaculars, that they are still important and that they still have implications for how children express themselves in class and how teachers respond to them. So I think, again, it's just an uphill battle and something we have to continue to fight for.
Bryant, you have a comment to that?
Hi. This is a great presentation, but I wanted to extrapolate a little bit of what you're doing to teachers, because we also have a mainly white female teaching population, but we're still trying to bring in teachers of color, and we need teachers of color. So how do you think, or what are your thoughts around how do we support culturally responsive teaching practices for teachers, not just teaching them how to be culturally responsive, but how are we culturally responsive to their own needs in the teacher education classroom or field?
So this probably is a good question, I think, for the chancellor as a leader of a higher education institution.
Well, I mean, it's our responsibility to continue to, two things. On the last question, what an opportunity this kind of body has to continue to take whatever the issue is and use your voice in all of the opportunity and impact right in this great city. The folk who make all these kinds of decisions, this energy, whatever the issue is, we can move from there. It's our responsibility as institutions, particularly higher education institutions, to begin to develop and educate and retool and practice what we sort of write and think about. When an organization like a higher education institution like the one I represent isn't doing that, then it's also your responsibility and my responsibility and all of ours to make sure that we hold each other accountable for that. And it doesn't matter who's coming through those programs, we need to make sure that we are teaching the kind of competencies that will make a difference for our children. So it's our responsibility to do it.
Well, I know we have one more question, but I know to be respectful of the time in the room here, I'm going to say if you have a question for one of the speakers, if you can speak with them afterwards. But I at least want to say thank you so much to the Chancellor and to my colleagues here, as well as those abroad. Thank you.
Wonderful job. You guys.